So we got the token stored in local storage. Now let's use it to automatically log a user in. And for that, we basically want to run some logic whenever our React app starts. When it starts, we want to check whether the user is logged in. Now the app.js file, the app component, is basically the first component that gets rendered when the app starts. Here in index.js, I render this app component as my root component. So any logic we run in here will run when the app, well, is starting up. So if we want to run some logic here whenever this component renders for the first time, we can use useEffect in the app component. So here I will add useEffect and add a function to it that should check local storage for a token. Now the dependencies of this function will be an empty array, which means this function here will only run once when the component mounts, when it rendered for the first time. And that's, by the way, important. useEffect always runs after the render cycle. I explained this earlier in the course already. It's just important to keep in mind. React will already render this component, but of course in the unauthenticated state by default then, and thereafter run this useEffect function for the first time. This is just how React works. You could theoretically manage a state which basically is something like is checking off, and unless this effect finished, this will be true, and you render some splash screen or some fallback page until checking off is done. Here, however, I will keep it simpler and just go to useEffect and in there check our local storage. So in local storage, I can get an item and get it by that key I used to store it. So in my case, that's user data, because that is what we use to store the data. And what we extract will be text. Now we know that it's text which can be converted to a JavaScript object because it will be JSON text, or text which is using the JSON format. Thankfully in JavaScript, we got this JSON object, which does not just have a stringify method to convert objects to JSON, but also a parse method to convert JSON strings back to regular JavaScript data structures like objects. So here I then got my stored data, which I extract from local storage. And this stored data will be such an object with a user ID and a token. So now we can check if we got stored data, so if this is not undefined, so put in other words, if we did find something there. And if we do have stored data, we can check if stored data.token is a thing. If that is a thing, we know we have a token, and therefore we could log the user in. So we could execute our login function here then, and forward stored data.userID and stored data.token. These are the two pieces we need here, and we then trigger our login logic. Now actually useEffect has a dependency, and that is our login function, but thanks to useCallback, this will only run once, and it will not rerun thereafter. And now here we just need to switch order and make sure we execute useEffect after these functions have been defined. So now here we ensure that login is executed with our data, with our user ID, and with the token if we got a token. So if we now save this and I reload here, you see indeed I switch to the logged in mode immediately. We see a brief flickering here because the first render cycle is in unauthenticated mode, but as I mentioned, you could avoid this by instead loading some splash screen for the very first render cycle until useEffect is done. You would just have to manage your is checking off status here inside useEffect and set it to false to indicate that you're done checking once you are done. Here, I don't really need that because it loads so fast, I don't think we have a real problem here with the user experience. So this is now using this token, but with this implementation, there are two things we're not doing. For one, when we're logging out, we're not clearing the token. That is something we can easily do. Here in logout, we just have to add local storage, remove key, and remove the user data. So that wasn't too hard. This ensures that when we do log out, we indeed stay logged out if we reload, so that we don't store the token in local storage. The more important thing we're not doing here, or the more severe thing we're not doing here, is that we're totally ignoring the fact that the token will expire. We shouldn't do that. For one, we want to log the user out automatically once the token expired. And second, when we try to auto log in the user based on the token he might have, we of course also want to check not only if we do have a token, but if that token still is valid. So we need to include the token expiration into our logic here.